At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
The author is in the house, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for this discussion of the Benedict Option with Rod Dreher, who is here. My name is John Barton. I'm going to keep my comments very brief, just so we can go ahead and get to the task at hand. But I'm the director of the Center for Faith and Learning, and we're one of the supporting partners for this event. And we're happy to do so and appreciate your presence and are confident that this will be a stimulating and challenging discussion tonight. The Center for Faith and Learning exists to help Pepperdine's faith community wrestle with issues of faith, Christian faith, and academic integrity, with our own academic life and work, and how those things influence one another. And tonight's event certainly plays to that. We organize retreats and workshops and seminars and book groups to try to make sure that questions of faith and learning stay front and center at this university's life. And in fact, even tonight, we've organized some book groups, some faculty and staff and students that have been a part of some book groups reading the Benedict Option for the last couple days and weeks in preparation for tonight, and are happy to do so. But while this event is right in line with the goals of the Center for Faith and Learning, we are only the supporting partner tonight, obviously. Tonight is really put on by the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and its Dean, Pete Peterson, and he'll get up in just a minute and explain some things about that. But we are happy to be celebrating the School of Public Policy's 20th anniversary as an institution tonight. And we feel pleased and honored to be a supporting partner for our friends and colleagues at the School of Public Policy and to celebrate with them and to be a part of this. Tonight we're going to be hearing about and talking about some very important issues. How to interpret our times, how to think about the trajectories that our country is on, how to think about faith and Christian community in the midst of all that. And I'll just close by saying two things that I'm grateful for tonight. First, I'm grateful that we have a platform for civil discourse. And if there's one thing that is true in our country, if there's one thing that everyone is agreeing on in our country right now, it's that we don't have enough platforms for civil discourse. We seem to have platforms for people to shout at one another and for sarcastic sound bites. But what we hope and what we know will happen tonight is we will have a platform for hearing controversial, sometimes ideas, but engaging those ideas with respect and engaging those ideas for robust dialogue as we grow and learn together. And second thing I'm grateful about, at Pepperdine University, as I just said, we care deeply about how Christian faith calls us to engage the challenges of our culture and our life and our world. And that's going to be what we're talking about tonight. We're going to hear an option, one that many people have considered provocative and controversial for how Christian cultural engagement needs to take place or can take place. But we're also going to hear some different opinions and challenges with a panel of people that will discuss it. The thing that I appreciate is everyone that's going to be up here tonight cares deeply about Christian faith and cares deeply about Christian witness. And I think that's something that we can be grateful for. So thank you for being here tonight, and I'm going to now turn it over to Pete Peterson, the Dean of the School of Public Policy, to give us a more formal introduction. Yeah.
So again, great to be here. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and at first blush, it might be slightly ironic that a School of Public Policy would be hosting a discussion around the Benedict Option. After all, we're a school that it cares very deeply about our next generation of public leaders and sending people into the public square and specifically into politics. Our graduates go on for careers in elected office and various fields from the federal government level to the local government level. And at least the way that this book has been betrayed, but I think we'll find it as we enter into the conversation, the way this book has been betrayed is that what Rod is making is an argument that we should be withdrawing from politics. And as someone who not only is The Dean of a School of Public Policy cares deeply about the state of our national politics and where we're sending our students out into. I'm also someone who ran for office at the statewide level. I ran an ill-fated campaign for Secretary of State here in California. I ran as a Republican, which is why I stand before you today as the Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. But it was that experience, really, that, especially as someone who was running for reasons that I honestly felt called to, that even in failure, I think there are a whole host of reasons why people of faith should be more deeply engaged in politics and policy. That's why I do what I do. It's why I left the private sector a dozen years ago. And it's why I encourage anyone who will listen to me to get into the public square. And especially as that public square is in the sphere of politics and policy, to do that. You know, it was interesting when I first made the decision to run, it was people of faith, brothers and sisters in Christ, who came to me and said, boy, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to get involved in that dirty political business? And I said, you're involved in Hollywood. You're telling me that politics is a dirty business? And so that's with all the institutions that Pepperdine looks to influence. I see Craig Detweiler here. Whether it's entertainment or politics or business, we are very much a school that is focused on preparing that next generation of leaders. The School of Public Policy is one of only 5 graduate policy programs in the United States of the 210 or 20 of them that's based at a Christian university. And so the reason we care about hosting discussions like this is because we want to talk about what is the role for people of faith in engaging in politics and policy. And that's why I'm so grateful that United deigned to bring Rod Dreher here this evening. This is actually the second event that we hosted for Rod. The first one was actually, we co-hosted his book launch event in Washington, D.C. with our friends at the Trinity Forum. It was at the National Press Club, and it really was a terrific event. And for anyone who's followed the arguments that Rod is looking to make, you know that this discussion around the Benedict Option is something that long predates this book. This book, in many ways, is a culmination of many of the columns that he wrote. And as both a columnist, writer, and thinker, I'm just very grateful for you, Rod, and your engagement in this set of issues, because it's hard to think about others who are willing to engage so thoughtfully and critically with the question around what is the role of people of faith in politics. So Rod Dreher comes to us from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He is a columnist and author, as you all know. He's the author of 4 books, and as I saw in reading through the titles of them, he started with the longest title and is gradually whittling down the titles of his books. So in 2006, he wrote Crunchy Cons, which is a great book if you haven't read it. Crunchy Cons, and here's the full title. Crunchy Cons, How Birkenstock Burkians, Gun-Loving Organic Gardeners, Evangelical Free-Range Farmers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-Wing Nature Lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America. You followed that up a little while later with the book The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, A Southern Girl, A Small Town, and The Secret of a Good Life. 2 years ago, he published How Dante Can Save Your Life, the life-changing wisdom of history's greatest poem. And of course, we're here tonight to talk about his latest book, The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian World. We look forward to Rod's next book, Rod Dreher, A Life. So please, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Rod Dreher.
Thanks, everybody. You can read Rod Dreher Life on my blog every day. My wife says, you have no unblogged thoughts, and I don't think she was paying me a compliment. I'm going to resist the temptation tonight to change my lecture to United Airlines, understanding incompetence through Christian eschatology. I'll talk about what actually came to talk about. I want to say at the top line tonight, which is the thing that constantly people get confused over, is I'm not saying that we have to completely withdraw from society. Let me just get that clear now. But I am saying that if, as Christians, we want to serve God and serve our fellow man as we're supposed to, we are going to have to withdraw to a certain extent to strengthen our faith, deepen our ties to each other, and so we can go out and represent Christ faithfully in the public square. So with that out of the way, I'm sure we'll come back to it later. I want to begin tonight by reading a passage from the English writer Paul Kingsnorth, a founder of the dark ecology movement, the dark mountain movement. He's talking about what he believes is the ongoing man-made collapse of the planet's ecosystem. Again, he's an environmentalist. This is his world. He writes, "Worlds are always ending. Empires are always falling. The climate has changed before. Change is the only constant. These are the comforting stories we tell to get ourselves through the night. These are the words that allow us to continue to avoid looking at the enormity of what we have done and are doing. They allow us to continue to pretend for a little while longer that the way we are living is right and normal and inevitable, and that it will continue. That these are problems that can be ironed out through the judicious application of our celebrated human cleverness." Does anybody really believe this down at the cellular level, down in their gut? Sometimes I think we all know inside, in the place where we are still wild animals, what we have done. Worlds are always ending, it's true, but not like this. This is new. This is bigger than anything there has ever been for as long as humans have existed, and we have done it. And now we're going to have to live through it if we can. Now, I'm not asking you to believe in global warming. I'm not here to talk about that tonight. But I'm asking you to consider that the phenomenon Paul Kingsnorth describes is very close to what I described in the Benedict Option. Kingsnorth focuses on the environment, on ecology, but I focus on Western Christianity and culture. Like Kingsnorth, I believe that Christians living in the West are lying to themselves, to ourselves, about the state of the faith today. We're doing so to comfort ourselves and to justify not changing our lives and the way we do things. But the religious collapse that we're living through today is bigger than anything that has ever been for as long as Christianity has existed in the West. We're going to have to figure out how to live through it with our faith intact, if we can. The argument in my book, The Benedict Option, goes something like this. Western Christianity is in a rapid state of collapse in the modern industrialized world. It's a matter of both quantity and quality. In the quantity part, let's talk numbers. I assume everybody here knows that the faith is on life support in Europe. America has long been a counterexample to that trend, but the more recent social science research shows definitively that the U.S. is now in the same steep downward trajectory that Europe pioneered. With the millennial generation, the bottom is falling out. The relatively large number of people we see in churches today, certainly compared to Europe, they're going to disappear in the decades to come, absent some miracle. In terms of quality, popular Christianity in the U.S. today has increasingly little to do with the faith as it has been historically understood and as it is presented in the Bible. The sociologist Christian Smith, who teaches at Notre Dame, has written at length about this phenomenon. He's documented that young American Christians have unwittingly replaced biblical Christianity with a pseudo-religion that appropriates Christian language, Christian imagery, to concoct a feel-good, emotion-driven, do-it-yourself religion that asks nothing more of its believers than that they be nice, feel good about themselves. There's good reason to believe that it's not just millennials. I'm 50 years old. I grew up in the 70s. This is the religion I grew up in, a cultural Christianity. Christian Smith calls this fake religion moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD. MTD is the last stop before abandoning Christianity altogether. There are deep historical forces at work in our civilization that make it very hard to reverse this religious decline. which has been building momentum for centuries. We can talk about all this later if you want, but the thing to understand now is the problem is what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has called liquid modernity, the condition that we all live in. It means that the rate of change, liquid modernity, means the rate of change has technological, economic, social, and so forth, has sped up so fast that nothing seems solid anymore. This process has dramatically fragmented and atomized society, shattering the connections among people and between the past and the present, and frankly, into the future. In general, we no longer have a common narrative that binds us together. It gives us a sense of transcendent meaning and connection to each other. In the church, 500 years after the Reformation, we are very near to the point where every Christian, even in the Catholic Church, regards himself as his own pope. Again, we can talk later about how this came about, but the essential point to keep in mind now is that there is no stopping the process of dissolution and of fragmentation. It's happening all over the West, and as I've said, it's tearing apart the Christian church. The reason it is worse now than it ever has been is that we are very quickly becoming a culture in which people do not believe in any non-scientific truth that contradicts what they want to believe. In other words, we are without the means to lift ourselves collectively out of this morass of relativism. Pope Benedict called it the dictatorship of relativism. That's what we're living in right now. We are, in short, like the Roman Empire at its point of collapse. It took a long time for Rome to fall, but once the pieces were in place, the collapse was unstoppable. The end of the empire, that was unthinkable to Romans. I mean, think about the 4th century. They just could not imagine that this would ever happen. That they had the Roman state as a republic and then an empire had existed for many centuries, and it always would as far as they knew. But that wasn't the case. The collapse of empire left Western Europe in chaos and darkness. It was not just a cultural and civilizational collapse, it was economic too and technological. There was no hope that the empire could be restored. People had to figure out how to deal with it, and they did. This is where Benedict comes in. St. Benedict was a young Roman Christian born in the year 480 who responded to the moral and the social and religious collapse around him by withdrawing from the city of Rome and going to the woods to pray, to fast, and to seek God's will. Eventually, he founded a monastic order and wrote a manual for monastery life. Today we call it the Rule of St Benedict. St Benedict in the Rule calls his manual, calls a monastery a school for the Lord's service. When he died in the year 547, Benedict left behind a few monasteries in the vicinity of Rome, out in the forest near Rome. He could not have known the effect his monastic movement would have on the future of Western Europe. Over the decades and even centuries to come, men flocked into the monasteries, which spread like wildfire across Dark Ages Europe. Within the monasteries, the monks lived a disciplined communal life, prayer, worship, work, and study. In their libraries, they copied precious manuscripts from the Greco-Roman past. Christian works, certainly, scripture and the fathers of the church, their commentaries, but also pagan manuscripts. In this way, the monasteries served as a kind of ark or arks, a fleet of arks carrying cultural memory across the dark sea of chaos and forgetting. The monks were also cloistered, meaning that they didn't leave the monastery often, but that didn't mean they were isolated completely from society. They shared what they knew with the people living around them. They taught people how to pray, of course, and evangelize, but they also taught them how to garden, how to make things, and relate other practical skills that people needed to survive and make a civilization, but that had been lost in the collapse of Rome. And the monks, crucially, also established schools. What the Benedictines accomplished, without knowing what they were doing, was laying the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization around the year 800 or so. You can't pin it on a particular date, but it more or less, people think about it started with Charlemagne around the year 800. And then it kept building up higher and higher until you get to the High Middle Ages. These monks lived disciplined, ordered lives of faith and works. And in so doing, they were an enormous blessing to the people, the peasants among whom they lived. I have to be clear about this. Benedict did not set out to save civilization or to make Rome great again. He only set out to serve God in community and to do it in a way that was appropriate to the challenges of his own time. He and the men who followed him, and there were women too in women's monasteries founded by his sister, his twin sister Scholastica, they turned their backs on the project of shoring up the empire, a political and social order that they believed could not be saved. And instead, they focused on building up small, local communities within which they could live out their faith and the moral tradition that had come down to them. In time, that simple mission of just living faithfully in community in the monasteries, faithfully executed, had massively important results for Western civilization. So, if we today are like Rome, then who is our St. Benedict? What I call the Benedict Option is the choice that I believe all faithful Christians are obligated to make today if they want to keep the faith through this collapse. It's not the worship of an idealized past, but rather the transmission of fire through what promises to be a very long and cold night. In my book, I talk about specific things that the Benedictine monks do in obedience to the rule, and I suggest ways that we Christians who are living in the world, as we must, we're not called to the monastery, ways that we can incorporate monastic wisdom into our everyday lives. The goal is not to take back America or anything like that. The Benedict Option is absolutely not the Values Voters Summit in monastic garb. The goal is to embrace traditional Christian practices that will enable us to live faithfully and to build resilience for the trials to come. The trials we're living in now and the trials to come. As I said at the top of the talk, the Benedict Option is not a head-for-the-hills warning, but it is rather a counsel of strategic withdrawal from the culture war, a retreat behind lines that we can defend. Think of it like this. In the culture war, faithful Christians have been driven to the beach at Dunkirk. If we mount a frontal assault on the enemy, we're going to be annihilated. If we sit still on the beach and hope the enemy leaves us alone, that he'll pass us by, we're going to be destroyed. But if we climb aboard the little armada of boats in the channel and head for the relative safety of England, speaking metaphorically, then we will be able to recover, retrain, and prepare as a community of faith for the long struggle ahead, and be a blessing to those we help who are struggling also in this in the chaos that is coming down upon us. It might not work, but I firmly believe that we don't have any other realistic options. We can tell ourselves stories that comfort us, that things really aren't that bad, that if we just tweak this or that strategy, we're going to be able to get back to a good place. If we just elect this person, get the right judges on the bench, everything's going to sort itself out. Or that if we just keep doing what we're doing, everything is going to be okay. But eventually you get tired of lying to yourself, though. And when you reach that point, you might start to wonder about radical solutions. I should make clear that I think the crisis we're now in is a civilizational one, and that it will get a lot worse before it gets better. But for me, throughout this broad crisis, the most important institution to preserve is the church, by which I mean the historic Christian faith as we've understood it over the centuries. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, but I wrote my book for Catholics and Protestants too, people I call small O Orthodox Christians. What I mean by that, most generally, is Christians who adhere to one of the historic confessions of the Christian faith, pre-modern in the case of Orthodoxy and Catholicism, or early modern, as in the case of Reformation Protestantism. The differences among the three great traditions of Christianity are real, and we can't paper them over. But what we share, if you're on the more theologically conservative side, is the belief that authentic biblical Christianity cannot be fully reconciled with liquid modernity, and that any attempt to compromise with liquid modernity will end with our being assimilated out of existence. Paul Kingsnorth, the Dark Mountain co-founder, is not a religious man, but he also counsels what he calls strategic retreat for environmentalists. He urges them to move to the country, to smaller places, and focus on saving what they can. Kingsnorth used to be an environmental activist, but he came to believe that the problems we were facing on the environmental front were so enormous that activism was largely futile in the face of all these tectonic changes in our civilization. Kingsnorth rejects as a false choice the idea that if you step away from full engagement around the cause, that you're given up. That's just not true, he says. He thinks of restoring his own little farm and raising his kids out in the English countryside as disconnected as they can be from dehumanizing machine society. He thinks of that as a truly practical form of resistance. Instead of fighting against what he hates, a fight he doesn't think his side can win at this point, Kingsnorth chooses to fight his own little battle for what he loves, and to do so at a small, local, manageable scale where he might actually achieve something. Just this week, I was reading his new collection of essays, and I was astonished to discover this guy, Paul Kingsnorth, telling his followers that they should approach their lives with the mentality as if they were medieval monks, responsible for saving the true, the good, and the beautiful within monastery libraries with the barbarians outside. Like this guy, I gotta meet him. I'm just learning about him now, but we're walking the same path, and he's not a religious man at all. He's focused on the environment, but we think we have a lot of the same intuitions. Kingsnorth said that they should form networks with like-minded people and help each other ride out the storm. Well, this is what St. Benedict did, by the way, and from that small mustard seed of faith in action embodied in monastic communities, the restoration of civilization grew. Kingsnorth writes, quote, "It's not about defeat or surrender. It's about pulling back to a place where you can find the breathing space to be free and human again. From that, all else follows, if you can pay attention." This idea, understood in a traditional Christian key, is the Benedict Option. Now, in my book, I talk about how we might live out the Benedict Option in various parts of our lives, family life, education, and dealing with technology in the workplace, and so forth. But tonight, I'm here to talk about the Benedict Option and politics. I believe that the Ben-Op has certain implications for how we think about and practice politics. I'm going to outline those for you now, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about it later. I know that some of you who don't know my work well are thinking, this guy is a political and religious conservative. Where does he stand on Donald Trump? Well, I think Donald Trump is not the solution to any of our problems. He's actually an acute symptom of a deeper crisis we all face, a crisis at the heart of our democracy. I think he's a terrible president, but tonight I don't want to get into a deeper analysis of Donald Trump's sins and failings. I know a lot of my Christian friends who voted for him, knowing full well what they were getting, but they felt like it was a matter of protecting religious liberty, and I can respect that. I mean that seriously, not patronizingly. But I will say to my fellow conservative Christians who do put their hopes for restoration in Donald Trump, if you're doing that, you're just fooling yourself. But at the same time, I would broaden the critique to say to all Christians, even those who dislike Trump and oppose him, if you're putting your hopes in politics, period, you're delusional. I'm a conservative who's a registered independent. I usually vote Republican, but in truth, I don't have any faith in the Republican Party. The only faith I have in the Democratic Party is that it can be counted on to be exceptionally hostile to people of faith who are not sufficiently progressive. This is why I usually vote Republican, but to say my heart is not in it is to greatly understate matters. The degeneration of both parties into identity politics on both sides, I think that's going to continue, I'm afraid. Given that the American people seem to have given up on the idea of the common good, I really don't see what might stop this process. I hope I'm wrong, but to me, I feel that we've been watching this happen for a long time, and it seems like it has a certain momentum that's just not going to be stopped. It's not that I think politics are bad per se. We have to be involved in politics insofar as politics means how we work out our common life together. There are good men and women who serve at every level of government and in public policy. Let me make that clear. The problem I see is the widespread belief among Christians that politics, especially conservative politics, can address effectively the fundamental problems among us in this time and in this place. Look, we should still vote and stay involved locally, at least. but we should be realistic about how little of substance in these macro issues that conventional political activism will change. No administration in Washington, no matter how ostensibly pro-Christian, is capable of stopping the cultural trends towards materialism and fragmentation and atomization that have been building for centuries. To expect anything different is to make a false idol of politics, and that sentimentality and that idol worship is going to end in bitterness and cynicism. Trust me. This is an idol that we conservative Christians have been worshiping for far too long. In the Benedict Option book, I talked to Lance Kinzer. He's a Kansas lawyer, an evangelical, and a former Republican state representative. After working for years in the Kansas legislature, particularly strong on pro-life legislation, he left pure politics to devote himself to lobbying in state legislatures around the country on behalf of religious liberty, and to focus on building up his own congregation, a PCA Presbyterian congregation there in suburban Kansas City. The former legislator sees this as vital work to prepare his own congregation for the new reality, one that he believes most American Christians still don't grasp. He told me that, quote, "The big challenge, especially for evangelicals who always believed that there was some sort of silent majority on their side, is to come to terms with the fact that this just is not true. This is difficult and this is disorienting. Internalizing the fact that it is not the case is difficult for a lot of people," said Lance Kinzer. But conservative Christians have to do this, Kinzer says, because if they don't, they're going to miss the most important thing they can do right now, which is to embrace forms of Christian living, practices that reinforce the truth that believers, faithful traditional believers, are strangers living in exile in post-Christian America. Lance believes that Christians have to stay involved in politics to some degree, but with their eyes wide open about how much more diminished our possibilities for cultural change through politics are, with no illusions about how the pursuit of worldly power, what it's doing and will do to our credibility as Christians and to our witness. To get personal for a moment, as a Christian who is morally and theologically conservative, as I was saying earlier, I find it really hard to find a home in either political party. I don't really care for the way the Republicans seem to favor the rich and big business at every turn and how quick they are to want to go to war. But I don't like the stance Democrats take on the abortion issue and on marriage and family. And since the Clinton presidency, I really don't see them as being all that different from Wall Street, different on the Pacific Wall Street as the Republicans. It profits a man nothing to gain the White House and Congress, but lose his soul. This sense of disempowerment I feel when I think about national politics, as I said earlier, does tempt me to bitterness and cynicism. But that's the wrong response. That's an incorrect response. I'm not politically powerless at all, and neither are you. It's just that we have to rethink what it means to be politically active. There's a saying that says politics is downstream from culture. We have a disordered politics because we have a disordered culture. If we want to see a more responsible politics, then we had better pay attention first to healing the culture. Pete was talking about a book I wrote about Dante and about how reading the Divine Comedy, of all things, really saved my life, pulled me out of a serious crisis in my life that was threatening to keep me chronically ill for the rest of my life. It's amazing. I don't read poetry and I don't read fiction, but I stumbled into this book one day, and there was so much wisdom and practical wisdom embedded in this poem from 14th century Italy. There's a key moment of the Divine Comedy that comes at the halfway point in the pilgrim Dante, the character Dante's journey through the underworld. And he's going down to hell, he's going up the mountain of purgatory, and then we'll go into paradise. So he's halfway up the mountain of purgatory, and he meets a man named Marco. He tells Marco that he's come from a world, Tuscany in the early 14th century, that is degenerating into a war of all against all, family against family, church against the state, city against city. It's just a mess, a chaotic mess. He begs Marco for some wisdom that he can take back to the world to heal his badly broken society, where people were so caught up in their own individual interests that they had lost sight of the common good. Marco tells him, the world is blind, and you come from that world too. He says, ultimately he tells him, if you want to heal the world, start with your own heart. Start in your own life, because that's the one thing you can control. Build out from there. That's really good political advice, actually, for us in our current crisis. And I had to see that. It took me reading a poem, a work of art, to actually see this truth. The Benedict Option does not counsel retreat from public engagement, but rather it says that we need to refocus on the local and paying more active attention to our little communities in which we live. Start by building these small communities up where we live, and our families, that's the first community. But beyond that, into our churches, our parishes, our schools, and other institutions of civil society, and gradually expand outward. Don't be satisfied just to build your own church up, for example, and turn your back on the world. Keep expanding outward, but start locally. We need to start, too, by rethinking what we mean by politics. We like to imagine that campaigns, elections, activism, lawmaking, all the elements of statecraft and democracy, that's politics, and it is politics. But in the most basic philosophical sense, politics is a process by which we all agree on how we're going to live together. That is, how we order our lives in community. If we expand our concept of politics to include building up local culture to embody clear ideals of the good life in community, all kinds of opportunities open up to us. All communities, whether it's in your church, in this university, or in the state, and so on, they're all governed by a vision of order constructed according to some shared sense of the good. We have to accept, I believe, that in fact what contemporary America thinks of as the good, the unbridled pursuit of individualism and self-gratification, is incompatible with what Christianity teaches is the good. In the years to come, faithful Christians may well have to choose between being a good American and being a good Christian. In a nation where God and country are so intertwined, the idea that one's citizenship might be at radical odds with one's faith is a new one. But I think it's one we have to start thinking about. Because it prescribes government of the people, liberal democracy can only be as strong as the people who live under it. Alexis de Tocqueville was convinced that democracy could not survive the loss of the Christian faith. Self-government requires shared convictions about moral truths, he believed. Christian faith drew men outside of themselves and taught them that laws must be firmly rooted in a moral order and guaranteed by the transcendent God. If a democratic nation loses religion, he wrote, then it falls prey to inordinate individualism, materialism, and democratic despotism, and inevitably, quote, prepares its citizens for servitude. This is how a republic becomes an empire. Therefore, said Tocqueville, quote, one must maintain Christianity within the new democracies at all cost. Well, we've not done that. A civilization in which no one felt an obligation to the past, to the future, to each other, or anything higher than self-gratification is a civilization that is dangerously fragile. And that's us. In the waning decades of the Western Roman Empire, St. Augustine described society as preoccupied with pleasure-seeking, selfishness, and living just for the moment. Sound familiar? American Christians, I believe, and this might sound weird, but we have much to learn from the experience of Czech dissidents under communism. The essays that the Czech playwright and political prisoner Václav Havel and his circle produced under oppression and persecution, far surpassing any that American Christians are likely to experience in the future, offer an appealing vision for an authentic Christian politics in a world in which believing Christians are an increasingly powerless minority. Havel died in 2011, but in his life he preached what he called anti-political politics, the essence of which he described simply as living in truth. His most famous and thorough statement of this was a long 1978 essay titled Power of the Powerless, which electrified the Eastern European resistance movements when it first appeared. It's really a remarkable document, one that is not only a great document from the history of the Cold War and human freedom, the movement of human freedom, but it's one that bears careful study and reflection by faithful Christians living in the West today. Havel said that, quote, a better system will not automatically ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life can a better system be developed. The answer then is to create and support parallel structures in which the truth can be lived in community. Isn't this a form of escapism, a retreat into a ghetto? Not at all, says Havel. A countercultural community that advocated its responsibility to reach out and serve others would end up being a more sophisticated version of living within the lie. A good example of what this better life could look like comes from the mathematician and Czech dissident Václav Benda, who was one of Havel's circle, one of his colleagues. A faithful Catholic, the only Christian among that circle, Benda believed that communism maintained its iron grip on the population in part by isolating them, by fragmenting their natural social bonds. The Czech regime severely punished the Catholic Church, driving many believers to completely privatize their faith, retreating behind the walls of their homes so as not to attract attention from the authorities. I think that's what a lot of people think the Benedict option is, but no. Benda's distinct contribution to the dissident movement was the idea of a parallel polis, a separate but porous society existing alongside the official communist order. Benda believed it wasn't enough to dissent from the ruling political order, but one also had to find a positive way to engage the world. At serious risk to himself and his family, he and his wife had 6 children, Benda rejected the idea of living behind the equivalent of a gated community for Christians. He saw no possibility at all for collaboration with the communists, but he also rejected quietism, considering that to be a failure to display proper Christian concern for justice, charity, and bearing evangelical witness to Christ in the public square. For Benda, Václav Havel's injunction to live in truth could only mean one thing: to live as a faithful Christian in community, facing outwards, to share the light of Christ with those around him. He insisted that the parallel polis must understand itself as fighting for, quote, the preservation or the renewal of the national community in the widest sense of the word, along with the defense of all the values, institutions, and material conditions to which the existence of such a community is bound. This is not a man who is willing to retreat into a gated community, and he saw recovering and strengthening the Christian faith, even in the face of oppression, as being absolutely key to ultimate national renewal. I believe that dissident Christians should see, in this culture, should see their Benedict Option projects as building a better future not only for themselves, but for everybody around them. That's a grand vision, but Benda knew most people really weren't interested in grand visions and standing up for abstract causes that only appealed to intellectuals. He advocated practical actions that ordinary people could do in their daily lives. If atomization, abstraction, and alienation are at the core of political and social problems, then the first step is to get outside our own heads. We reestablish ties with the people God gives us to serve in our own families, in our congregations, our schools, and so forth. But it has to start small, with people you can trust. That's what Benda knew, and Havel knew too. In order to know what your neighbors need and want, you have to be close to them. In Benda's time, the Czech people had very little concept of themselves as a community. The totalitarian government had taken all that away from them. In our time, I think we give it away ourselves by pouring ourselves into our computers and our televisions and our smartphones. Benda's attempt to repoliticize his people consisted of activating their desire, their natural desire, simply to be together, to be social in whatever way they found pleasing. For Benda, just having a community meal was a political act because it recreates the conditions for authentic political community. Benedict option politics requires patience. The Czech dissidents resolved to take up anti-political politics, not because they thought it would succeed in overturning communism necessarily, but because they believed with all their heart that it was worth doing for its own sake. Living in truth, as they saw it, was a form of reclaiming their humanity in the face of a dehumanizing system. None of them could have imagined that they would ever live to see the day when the Berlin Wall fell and communism in their own country would disappear. They didn't plan for that. They just kept their eyes on the prize of righteousness, of living in truth, and being a decent person, not being co-opted by the system. And they tried the best they could to live it out inside small worlds that they could control, and to patiently, as I've said, expand outward. Václav Havel was not a religious believer himself, but if you read his essays, he was clearly a man who lived by really noble ideals. Communism itself, he said, wasn't the core problem of modern life. Communism was just a particularly vicious form of materialism, a way of living in the world that denies that there's any such thing as transcendent values. From behind the Iron Curtain, Václav Havel chastised the democratic, free, capitalist West, saying that we too were in danger of losing our souls to the same idols, seen from a different angle across the Iron Curtain border. This is still true today. In the US, our politics are inadequate to address the core problems that bedevil us, because in both their left-wing and right-wing conventional forms, they operate from the position that facilitating and expanding human choice is the proper end of our politics. In other words, we focus on choice, expanding choice itself, not on what's chosen. The left and the right just disagree on where to draw the lines. In my view, neither party's program is consistent with Christian truth. By contrast, the politics of the Benedict option assume that the disorder in American public life derives from the disorder in the American soul. All political problems are ultimately religious problems. Benedict option politics starts with the proposition that the most important political work of our time is the restoration of that inner order, harmonizing with the will of God. The same telos is life in a monastic community. Everything else follows naturally from that. Havel said, the best resistance to totalitarianism is simply to drive it out of our own souls, our own circumstances, our own land, to drive it out of contemporary humankind. The same is true, I believe, for the corrosive anti-Christian consumerism and individualism and selfishness that seems to have taken over American public life in many forms. At their best, Benedict option communities can provide an unintentional political witness to secular liberal culture, offering, I believe, a potent contrast to a set of increasingly cold and indifferent political and economic arrangements. The state is simply not going to be able to care for all the human needs in the future, especially if the current projections of growing economic inequality prove accurate. The sheer humanity of Christian compassion and the image of human dignity and honors will be, I believe, an extraordinarily attractive alternative, not unlike the evangelical witness of the early church amid the declining paganism of an exhausted Roman Empire. In closing, let's return to the vision of Paul Kingsnorth of the Dark Mountain movement. The ecological crisis, in his view, and I agree with him on this, is only a manifestation of a more fundamental crisis. For Kingsnorth, the core of the problem is that we in modern times have been living by false myths. For him, it's a problem of story. Among them, the myth of progress. That myth says that everything is inevitably going to get better and better and better the more we bring the world, especially nature, under our technological control. A related myth is that we humans are intended to have ultimate mastery over all things, that we only have to live within the limits that we individuals set for ourselves. The myth of progress exiles the sense of religious awe that all humans who are properly oriented to the natural world have. This is Kingsnorth. Again, I remind you, he's not a Christian, but a traditional Christian like me has a lot more in common with an unbeliever like Paul Kingsnorth than I do with a lot of people, my fellow Christians, who fully accept the myth of progress, but add a little Jesus into the mix for the sake of soothing their consciences. The myth of progress is losing its power in the West today. What's going to take its place? It doesn't require much reflection to grasp that some very dark ideologies are slouching towards Bethlehem, perhaps to be reborn. But the self-centered pseudo-Christianity or moralistic therapeutic deism, it's not strong enough to stand up to this kind of hatred that we're seeing starting to bubble up. Imagine that Martin Luther King had tried to face down the police dogs and fire hoses, armed with nothing but the faith of a Joel Osteen. And you'll get the picture of how precarious things really are. 2 weeks ago, I was in Paris having coffee with a man named Alain Finkielkraut, who is probably the leading public intellectual in France. He's an avowedly secular man, but he is in real philosophical despair about the future of his country and of Europe as a whole. He believes they're committing spiritual and cultural suicide, and he sees no way out. I asked him, listened to him say this. He was a French intellectual who was talking very doom and gloom, and I happened to think he was right to a certain point. But I looked at him and said, well, where do you find hope? He said very quietly, I have no hope. I told him, well, I'm a Christian, and my hope is in Jesus Christ. But for a Christian, though, hope is not the same thing as optimism. Christian hope is rather the certain conviction that no matter what happens, no matter how much we have to suffer, God is present in it. And things can work towards the ultimate redemption of the world, even in ways we can't see right now in our limited circumstances, if we unite our suffering to Christ. This is the hope of the martyrs. I told my interlocutor, Mr. Finkelkraut, that I didn't know if Europe or liberal democracy or the United States or Western Christianity was going to survive the times to come. But I have come to orient my own life around the historical Christian narrative presented to me in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm now trying to figure out every single day what it means to live as a faithful Christian in what I consider to be a Babylonian exile. If you think about it, a lot of Christians talk about Jeremiah 29 as being something that we should take into ourselves, and I agree with that. The idea that God told the Hebrews in their Babylonian exile through the prophet Jeremiah that he had called them there into exile for a reason. And he called on them to plant themselves fully in Babylon and to pray for the peace of the city and the prosperity of the city and so on. But people don't often talk about the book of Daniel, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think we can only understand Jeremiah 29 if we think about the story of the three faithful Hebrew men who served the king. You couldn't be more embedded in Babylonian society than that. But when the king asked them to forsake their God and bow down before the false idol, they chose the prospect of death before apostasy. If we are going to live in this American Babylon, as we're called to do, this is where we live, we're going to have to develop the kind of resources within ourselves and our communities to hold on to the faith like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so that when we are put to the test, we will not falter. Anyway, I was telling this to Alain Finkelkraut about how my faith is what gives me hope, and he said that this path is closed to the French people. We have decided, he told me, that this life is all there is. We have accepted that death is the end of things. And that right there, I believe, is why resolutely secular post-Christian Europe is dying. But the French have one important advantage over us Americans. They know that they have lost the faith. They know God is dead in their hearts. Many of us American Christians don't realize yet that this has in truth happened to many of us, or is in the process of happening if we don't stop it right now, if we don't wake up and realize what's happening and turn it around. When I was over there in Paris promoting the French version of the Benedict Option book, the older French Christians I met, people like my age, I'm 50 and older, they tended to be very despairing over the future, not unlike Alain Finkelkraut. But not the young ones, not the men and women in their 20s and 30s. They had no illusions that following Christ could be completely and unambiguously reconciled with the pursuit of middle-class success and fitting in post-Christian France. They were free of the burden of that. Their parents weren't, the older Christians weren't. Being a committed Christian in secular France really cost you something today. Those who live by the Bible's narrative are convinced believers, really convinced believers who want something more than the middle-class Christianity that really is this conformist Christianity that's on its last legs there. They have seen and lived through the power of liquid modernity to dissolve faith and tradition and the permanent things. They're conservatives, I guess. We didn't even talk politics, but they seem conservative to me. But they're not the kind of conservatives that their mom and dad are. These young people see the false hope their parents have of regaining Christian political power by aligning themselves with the right politician in France. They've seen that that is a dead end, and they reject it. They're not interested in it because they have set their sights on the long-term future. And because of that, they've also set their sights on the distant past. They want the faith of their ancestors. They want tradition. They want Christian orthodoxy. They want a faith that is moral, certainly, but not a faith that is moralistic, that's based on nothing but ethical rules. Without the experience of awe in the living God, and the experience of awe in the presence of the living God, Christian morality is a very brittle thing. These young Christians, though, in France, they're not in despair at all. They can see the bankruptcy of a wholly secular politics and economic system built on pure rationality and technocracy. They are unwilling to shore up that empire any longer. They want something else. And that's why they came to hear me talk about the Benedict option. I told them, look, I don't have all the answers, because we've never been in a place exactly like this in our civilization. But I hope I'm asking the right questions. We're going to have to work out the answers to these challenges on pilgrimage together. We are lost, to go back to Dante, we are lost in a dark wood with no idea how to get out. I'm convinced that just as heaven sent Virgil to the fearful and confused Dante at the beginning of the Inferno, and just as heaven sent St. Benedict to the shattered former Roman Empire to show them the way out, I'm convinced God in the same way will not abandon us. For all we know, the new and quite different St. Benedict that we need is sitting right here in this room, hearing these words. This is bigger than anything that has ever been for as long as Christianity has existed. And we have done it, and now we're going to have to live through it if we can. Dare to imagine that God might be calling you to help build those arks to carry His word, His truth, and His people, His suffering people, across the sea of night that's now closing in. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So we are now going to move to a time of responses and questions here. And I want to make sure that we leave some time as well for you to ask some questions as well. So please welcome the Dean of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Dr. Dan Rodriguez here. Please welcome. And so Dan and I are going to first start with a couple responses and thoughts and opinions on the book and this talk, and then we'll engage in some questions, and then we're going to throw it open to you all. So please have some questions ready before we conclude here. And I'll give you this mic. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you. It's wonderful to be asked to be a part of this evening, this dialogue. It'd be really fascinating to see the kind of responses that your presentation and book have elicited in the audience. I was asked to briefly respond, and I just wanted to let you know, when I first heard about your book, I heard about it from some conservative white evangelicals who right away, just like, you've got to be careful. This is maybe one of the most dangerous books in the last many years. And so it just made me very curious. And so my response is coming from a distinctly Hispanic evangelical perspective. I'm a missiologist. I teach missions here. I'm teaching a course right now. And I wish I would have required your book for this semester. Would have been a great addition to some other things that we're reading in the class. I found your challenge provocative, this idea of a strategic withdrawal. And I would say it is strategic. It's not just withdrawal. It's withdrawal for a purpose, as you described, to be able to look out. What you have to say about politics, public education, the workforce, unnecessary and harmful use of technology, all of those chapters I found really fascinating. But I kept coming back to what I sense were your goals, and that is to help form distinctly Christian villages that will help Orthodox believers, Catholic, Protestants, even evangelicals, to do at least two things: resist assimilation, especially by their children, of this degenerating culture characterized by what you call hostile secular nihilism, liberal autonomous individualism, and liquid modernity. What in the old days, Orthodox traditional conservative Christians called hedonism. We don't usually use those kind of terms anymore. And then also to preserve a distinctly Christian way of life that's integral, it's not compartmentalized, and I appreciate that. But you also said something that I wish you would have elaborated on, that is, this is for the world. And if there's going to be a revision, I hope there will be an expansion on what do you mean by resisting assimilation, preserving a distinctly Christian culture for the world. But as I read your book, I was also thinking about an analogous situation. I study Hispanic evangelical Christianity, particularly immigrant churches. Hispanic, but also there are comparisons with groups like Korean Christian churches. And many of them have a very similar view of the dominant culture here, and many of them have taken a similar approach. Their interest is to help their children resist assimilation, and to preserve their ancestral culture and language, their way of life in a hostile new land. Many Hispanic evangelicals refer to this country as Egypt, and they've come here from the Promised Land in Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world because this is Egypt, and they can survive here. But they don't want their children to become Egyptians or hyphenated Egyptians. And as I study that phenomenon, I think about this comparison. And so one of the questions I had for you that we could talk about later, or just might elicit other questions, is the following. That is, how will Christian teenagers and emerging young adults respond to the Benedict option? Because what's happened in the Hispanic community in particular is second and third generation Hispanic teenagers and young adults really resist their parents' agenda to preserve a particular type of culture. So what will happen? How will Christian teenagers and emerging adults respond to the Benedict option? What will happen when it's embraced by church leaders and parents, but not by teens or emerging adults? Unlike Benedictine monks, many of these children, teens, and emerging adults will feel like they're being withdrawn involuntarily by their parents. And I'm thinking about some of the suggestions about public education, cell phones, and social media. So that's one question, but the other is just a very brief question, again from a perspective that's missional. I am a recovering missionary, I'm a missiologist, and when I read the scriptures in particular, from a missional perspective, I ask myself, don't the lives of biblical characters, and you just mentioned some, Joseph in Egypt, the exiles in Babylon, Daniel, who you just mentioned, Esther, Nehemiah, the apostles, the early church, even Jesus of Nazareth, seem to suggest, their lives suggest that it is indeed possible, and that's my question to you, to resist assimilation and preserve a corporate and godly vision for the good life without withdrawing from dominant society. And it seems like the contemporary persecuted church in the global south that's thriving in Babylon, I think has much to offer us as well. And so I'd like to know what some of your responses are to that when we have a chance.
Well, thank you, Dan. I would just say very briefly that I think one of the things that most surprised me about the book before I read it and heard about it was just how personally convicting it was. I don't think you can read the Benedict option without taking into deep account your own personal faith. And I want to thank you for writing a book that called me into questioning where I was in my faith, what my own commitments were, what my own thoughts were vis-a-vis politics, and where I was in my own disciplines. Because I don't think you can read this book, which has been framed as this attack on culture, without really taking into personal account where you are in your own faith. And so I just want to thank you for writing the book in that way, and I hope more people get a chance to read it and understand it really as something that is a personal diagnosis. So thank you for that. I also want to say that I agree with many of the parts that you're talking about. The Christian Smith's moralistic therapeutic deism, I think, is very much in full effect in certainly the evangelical church, and is something that especially here in the West, especially here in Southern California, especially in the white evangelical church, is something that we need to be thinking about very seriously and taking into account where we sit on those set of issues. Is God there for wishing that we have a happy life and that all good people go to heaven? Is that what Christianity is? And I think that is what's being preached and at least thought about. On the part, though, about the political engagement, and also thinking about, as Dr. Rodriguez talked about the engagement of the church, whether Catholic or evangelical, in what could be construed as ethnic minority communities, I think it is a different picture here, and especially as it relates to political engagement. You mentioned towards the end of your remarks here the example of Martin Luther King, and he, in many ways, you read his many speeches or letter from a Birmingham jail, it almost seems like the anti-Benedict option, at least the way that it's perceived. He really was calling people of faith to engage, and not just at the local level, but also at the national level, because of the issues were being determined out of Washington and on a federal level. And I think as my understanding and engagement with local churches here that are more ethnically diverse, I think there is a different perception here on what the Benedict Option could mean for them and really the importance of engaging in politics. I'll go back to saying, though, that I think what's also very important about your book is your call for people, especially Christians, to engage at a more local level. This is certainly what we do at the policy school. We send a lot of people out into local government, and as many people as me being a political conservative, as many people on my side of the aisle that are always thinking about things at the national level, ask them who their school board members are, who are determining the curriculum that their kids are taking in a public school. They have no clue. Ask them who their city council members are, who are determining, what's happening in the design of the spaces in which they live in the local level, and whether there are parks or not. No clue. Ask them about issues that we are getting more involved in as a Christian church, like the foster system, which is determined on a county-by-county level. Ask Christians if they know who their 5 county supervisors are here in LA County. No clue. And so your call here to, but everybody knows who Donald Trump is, right? So this call here that you make to not disengage from politics, but also to really focus on things that, quite frankly, at a political and policy level are determining, 60 to 70% of the policy engagement that we have as people living here in West Los Angeles and Southern California, I think is so important, whether it's to work on the administrative side of government or to run for office. These are issues that you can put your arms around. And I think, unfortunately, what I've seen, although not true of the students at the policy school, but what I'm seeing of a younger generation is they've taken in part to heart, for very different reasons, what they may have heard about the Benedict Option, which is to disengage from politics as a whole. Like, the whole thing is a mess, the whole thing is corrupt, the whole thing is House of Cards. Why would I ever want to get involved in that? And I think it would be an immense tragedy if this generation, this millennial generation, understood that politics was just a dirty business that they didn't want to get involved in, because really the call is there, especially at the local level, to make a real difference. So with that, I'll just close by saying, and this will be my question, and we'll go first, Dan, to yours, and then I want to obviously engage you all in some questions. There is a question here. There was a point that you made towards in that chapter about Christian politics and the Benedict Option. I just wanted to read the quotation. Quote, "Politics is no substitute for personal holiness. The best that Orthodox Christians today can hope for from politics is that it can open a space for the church to do the work of charity, culture building, and conversion." That's still a lot of space. And there are a lot of issues that intersect, from education to foster system to a lot of different issues that intersect, to tax policy even. So my question is going to be, doesn't that still demand for Christians to engage in politics, even at a national level, because there are some of those intersections there? So Dan, if you would repeat your question, and then we'll...
There were 2, but maybe just one.
I'm happy to answer both. I just need to be reminded.
Well, one was, how will...
Got up to 4:30 this morning.
It's been a long day. How will Christian teenagers and emerging young adults respond to the Benedict Option? And what will happen, particularly when it's embraced by their church leaders, their parents, but not by them? Again, they're not making a voluntary decision like the Benedictine monks or maybe their parents to withdraw. For them, it would be involuntary. And what are you seeing in terms of people who are embracing the Benedict Option? How is it impacting generations?
Sure. Well, that's a fantastic question. And the short answer is I don't really know yet. And the book's been out for 7 months, but I know it's had a lot of talk, but I haven't seen a lot of action on the ground yet. It might be happening, but people still seem to be talking about it and asking what does it mean for them. But I write in the book about this community that, for me, it's an ideal Benedict Option. They live in Italy. They call themselves Tippiloschi, Italian for the usual suspects. They live in a small city called San Benedetto del Tronto. They're all lay people in the community. They're all very Orthodox in their Catholicism, but they're not angry about it. they're not fearful people, they're joyful people. They go to their normal parishes, they come together at their kind of a clubhouse on the hill overlooking the Adriatic. They garden together and invite the whole community to do community gardening. They do soccer, they raise animals, they feast together, but they also do Bible study together, and they have Mass there from time to time. And they invite the monks from Nursia that I write about in the book to come down and instruct them. When you go there to see them, you see a joyful community, a community that is bound together because they're very confident in their faith, but you don't feel like they're under siege. And I asked Marco Samarini, the leader of the group, he's also the head of the G.K. Chesterton Society of Italy, which gives you an idea of their sensibility, very merry guy. I said, how are you going to keep your kids here? Because they have a lot of young kids in the community, they've only been there since '93. He said, well, I don't know. He said, we have to hope for the best, because in Italy today, if you want to succeed economically, you have to go to Rome or Milan or one of the bigger cities. He said, all we can do is show them what life in community is like here, with families around there, and networks of families who are living out the Christian life in a joyful way, and hope they choose this, because they see it as something better than what the world has to offer. And I think that's really the only realistic strategy, because I did talk also to a young woman who was raised in a very defensive Catholic community where her parents were extremely fearful, and she became an atheist, and she said every one of her older brothers and sisters became atheists, because for them, the faith was not about joy and liberation, but about being afraid and defensive and seeing demons around every rock. So I think that's a bit negative example. The Tipolowski are a better example. What we're doing with our kids, we have 3 kids, 18, 13, and 11. We do have a TV in the house, but the TV is connected to Netflix and Amazon streaming. We curate what they watch. And we're not just, for us, quality TV doesn't simply mean no cursing, no nudity, no graphic violence, but we're trying to help them understand what beauty is at an age-appropriate level through film. We let them have some access to the smartphones, but only very, very regulated. Because what we want to do is build them up in the faith and in moral discernment and in virtue, again, at an age-appropriate level, so when they are confronted with temptation, they can say no to it. There are no guarantees or no formulas here, but I think the best we can do is model something healthy and happy and good for them, and just hope that this Holy Spirit speaks to them and keeps them on the straight and narrow.
My other question, probably you can't answer, but I'd like to know what you think, if you have a thought about it. Again, I raised the question, doesn't the contemporary persecuted church in the Global South have some lessons to teach us about resisting assimilation and the corrupting forces of society, while we preserve these godly visions? Many of these leaders have been influenced by books like Howard Wilson Willman's Resident Aliens, which no doubt you're familiar with. And they called the church to, like you, but an earlier generation, this radical new understanding of the church. This colony of resident aliens, a holy nation, a people, a barrio, in the middle of the secular city that's standing sharply, focused, against those values, the devalued world. And it just sounds a lot like what Peter was saying to the church, again, a persecuted church, when he says, you're foreigners and aliens, abstain from the simple desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives, he says, among the pagans. And so I'm wondering, what do you think, another book, looking at these communities that are trying to preserve, a vibrant form of Orthodox Christianity. Most of your examples are from Europe, post-Christian Europe, and places here in the United States. What about the Global South? What are your initial thoughts, you think?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I make clear that this is a book about what I call the West, meaning Europe, North America, Canada, and Australia. But of course, Latin America is the West too, But I'm talking to the people I'm familiar with, the people who are the majority in this country, but not the ones who are coming in. David Brooks's wife, Ann Snyder, lived in Houston for a while, and she's an evangelical. And she told me, she said, Rod, she read my book, and she said, I agree with you on where the church is among Anglicans. But she goes, I've lived here in Houston and hung out with a lot of immigrant communities, Vietnamese, Latin American, and you don't see that here. You see real hope and real community. And she said, you need to pay attention to that. And I said, absolutely. I said, you ought to write that book since you know the communities. But I think that we are going to be, if the faith is going to survive among Anglos in North America and Europe, it's going to be because we've been missionized, if that's a word, by people from the Global South, Christians from the Global South, who really have the faith and can bring it back to us. So I'm not as negative about immigration as a lot of conservatives are, because for me, I agree with Howard Watson Williman that the real community is the church, and community I want to be part of.
So I'm going to ask a quick question, but I want to make sure, I know that we're running over time. We started late, so we're just going to do it, right? You're going to have some questions. We want to engage. So I'm going to change my question.
Okay.
Because and just to go back to the politics theme, I think if Trump has done anything, he's put a leaf blower on what used to be the conservative coalition. And what's happened on the left with the rise of Bernie Sanders and that populist movement, which is certainly not going away, it's only strengthening, is that you'd mentioned in here the rise of populism and how it's affecting the parties, but where there's an opportunity for Christians as well. And I wonder if you had any thoughts that there's a possibility, not of a new party, but at least of some new coalitions being built with people of faith that are seeing this common ground between left and right. That whether it's on issues of the power of Wall Street or income inequality or some of these cultural issues, that this radical individualism that's been preached on the far right but also on the far left, the identity politics that you talk about that's present on the far left and also on the far right. Do you see any opportunity for new Christian coalitions, so to speak, to be built?
Dangerous words. That question reminds me of a story I tell in my book, Crunchy Cons, back in 2006, about when my wife and I moved to Dallas in 2003 from New York City. We started going to the farmer's market, and we got to know this fundamentalist Christian family who raised chickens and cows out in the countryside about an hour outside of Dallas. And I ended up profiling the Hutchins family, just great, great people. They're very organic because they believe that God, to be good stewards of God's earth requires organic farming. And these, again, Texas fundamentalists, really, really conservative people. And yet, Robert Hutchins, the father, said, since I started doing this, he left defense contracting to do this work. He said, since I started doing this, I feel like I have more in common with my secular hippies down the road who do the same kind of farming than I do with suburban Republicans in Dallas County. Mm-hmm. I thought there's real insight there. Mm-hmm. But notice they came together around food culture and around sustainable farming, that sort of thing, which they're not political hot buttons, because politics are so hot, so red hot in Washington around certain issues, that they had to be able to get together where they could talk to each other without getting angry at each other. And I feel that politics in Washington has become so polarized. I remember, I used to be an editorial writer and a columnist at the Dallas Morning News, and I remember looking at one of the Pew surveys in 2005 showing where Americans fall on the
it was like the two clouds and
right. Yeah. So it turns out that only 10% of the people on the right believe in very hardcore things that are at the heart of the Republican Party. Only 10% of the people on the left are the same way about the Democrats. Most people are in the middle. But that's not who has the power. That's not who has the money to donate. Most people tended to be more economically liberal and socially conservative. This was 2005. I'm sure things have changed. But I thought, isn't that crazy? That most people are actually in the center, but that's not where our media and that's not where the power is taken. So I feel like we have to get outside of pure politics in order to build those bridges and then see where that takes us. Do you have any thoughts about any possibilities where we might work together? Because I'm looking for hope. I'm serious when I say I don't have the answers. I hope I'm asking the right questions.
Yeah, well, I think you definitely are. I guess I would say that we are living history right now politically. And I really do believe that there will be a series of new coalitions. They still may They still may resolve to the Democrat and Republican parties, but I really do believe that this populist moment that we're in, that again comes from the left and right, is going to significantly change the issues that these two parties care about. Now, will there be an opportunity for a third party? Right now, I frankly doubt it. But I do think that the issues that the parties care about are going to change. And I think in that, how Christians engage with the party structure is going to change as well.
I think, Pete, that if we're going to be authentic Christians and represent ourselves, whether we're in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, as believers, we're going to have to double down on our own Christian identity, not in a negative way in terms of being nasty to other people, but going deep into Scripture, going deep into tradition, and thinking deeply about what does it mean to be a follower of Christ, and how does that set me apart from the post-Christian world?
Mm-hmm. And I would just say as well that for Christians on the left and right, whether the new coalitions or not, that holding our respective party, whatever one that you're connected to, holding our parties more accountable. And I'll say this as a registered Republican and conservative, that's something that I need to be doing more of in my own party.
Well, I can tell you too that I've really learned a lot by going to Christian colleges, Catholic and Evangelical, this year, talking about the book. And one of the things I learned was that I was early in the year, just before the book came out, I was at an Evangelical college in the Midwest, and talking about practices, the importance of practices like fasting, regular prayer, discipline, spiritual disciplines, and grounding the Christian life in something greater than emotion, and which is a real problem today, the fact that our faith is so emotional. After in the Q&A, one of the students stood up, an undergraduate, and said, I don't understand why you're saying that we need these practices. She thought it was works righteousness. She says, why isn't it enough to love Jesus with all our heart like we were taught growing up? And I answered her as best I could. I said, well, we have to love Jesus with all our heart, but that love has to be embodied, and it has to be manifest in actual structures and concrete things, or it's just going to dissipate. But she didn't really get it. A professor after this talk came up to me and said, that young woman's question was representative of 99% of our students on this campus. Said they come to us with a faith that has been formed by youth group culture, which is highly emotional, highly relational, that has no grounding in doctrine or practices or disciplines. And so when they come here to this school where everybody thinks like them and they're fine, then they get out into the real world and somebody says, your faith is mean. They don't know what to do. They collapse. That's the kind of thing that if we're going to challenge our parties and anybody else, we're going to have to know, what does it mean to be a Christian?
Right.
It would really be helpful as well, I think, to listen to what some of the Hispanic evangelical leaders are saying. You may be familiar with Sammy Rodriguez of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. Him and other leaders are I think, saying something very important to the white evangelical church in particular, from which they feel very marginalized. Again, over things like immigration. But one of the things that they say is something that you mentioned at the end of your talk, and that is, I think Christians, whether they're conservative Catholics, Protestants, or evangelicals, or Orthodox Christians, we need to ask ourselves about our own identity here. Are we American Christians, or are we Christians in America? And that's a very important question. And if we decide that we are Christians in America, as opposed to American Christians, then we need to ask ourselves, how do we approach, the public square? And one of the things that Hispanic evangelicals are embracing, or encouraging others to embrace, is to divorce politics, or their involvement in politics, from partisan politics. Because first of all, it doesn't serve them well as a constituency, but it also doesn't allow them to have a prophetic voice, which you described when you were talking about the reason that you are an independent. I share those same reasons. I'm an independent for very similar reasons. So I think there's a voice in our community that we need to listen to that would, I think, inform this conversation.
Dan, I was out at a conference about a month ago in San Diego of Christian philanthropists, all evangelical philanthropists. And Senator Ben Sasse came and gave the keynote address there. And here's a conservative evangelical Republican senator from Nebraska, had 45 minutes to talk. He didn't mention politics once. He started out talking about how the world that we're in now, it's in a lot of upheaval, and it's going to get more intense economically, in terms of family, and so on and so forth. He said all the things that people need for a happy life or a stable life, a good job, a family, close friends, a faith, all of these things are being called radically into question now by the forces in our society and technology, economy, and so on. He didn't say to them, give money to politicians. He said to these philanthropists, give money and give your time and your treasure to helping build up things locally that will enable people to have stable, good, godly lives. And I thought that was really something else. That guy's got it going on, I think.
And he's speaking at our 20th anniversary event, which I'm sure you knew.
I
Right.
didn't know that.
Yeah, well, look at that. He's
Ask him
keynoting.
about that. I would have loved to have asked him.
I will.
He didn't mention politics once.
I know.
But he was actually talking about politics, about keeping
polis.
the community together,
That's right.
fostering the community's flourishing.
That's right. All right, some questions. We got way over time, but whatever. Okay, yes.
I just want to say thank you for coming to Pepperdine. Really appreciate listening to your talk. So I have more of a critical question. You characterize modernity as a new dark age for Christianity, which is reflective of Alisdair MacIntyre's critique of modernity. And arguably that's not the most accurate narrative, especially with Charles Taylor writing A Secular Age, which kind of contradicts MacIntyre's narrative. But if we are to accept the argument that's proposed, the natural solution obviously is the bedmob. Yet, instead of a return to St. Benedict's monasticism, you encourage Christians to have meaningful spiritual formation through disciplined spiritual practices within a local Christian community. But not to be too pointed, but isn't this what followers of Christ have been saying for the last 2,000 years? How is your solution not a platitude or a common cliche?
Oh no, you're right. I'm just calling the church to be the church. But as Leah Labresco says, someone I interviewed in the book, she said, if you don't call it something, people aren't going to want to do it. But I do think that if we were doing that, if we were being the church as we're supposed to be, we would look a lot different. The world would look a lot different. And I wrote this book not to wag my finger at other people, but also to write about myself. And because it's no point in getting to the long story here, but there was, in my life, I came to Christ when I was 25, and I really threw myself into the church, into being a good Catholic and being a good Republican. And God humbled me. I was very arrogant about politics and religion back then. And God humbled me through the Iraq War, which I fully supported. I was in New York on 9/11, living there, and I thought I was being very patriotic and courageous. And in fact, I just wanted somebody to suffer for what we suffered in New York. And I had to repent of that bitterly. I realized how much my anger drove my political thinking. And also in the abuse scandal. I ended up losing my Catholic faith by reporting on the abuse scandal because I didn't realize how, I thought because I had all the arguments in my head, everything would be okay. That wasn't the case at all. I should have been doing practices all these years. I should have been in the soup kitchen and saying prayers at least as often as I was reading theology or talking about theology. So from my own lived experience, I want to encourage people, don't place idols, don't make the church, institutional church, an idol, don't make politics an idol, but also don't be so confident in what you know in your head. Because when you're put to the test, if you haven't sedimented the faith into your bones through regular prayer in community and doing certain practices, your faith may not survive. And that's all I'm talking about right there. And Charles Taylor, too, is right that we can't return completely to the past, being secularist, knowing that we have a choice. But I also feel that what else are we going to do then? It's like what the Tipolowski do. They know their kids have a choice, and they can't keep their kids from knowing that they have a choice to move. They have to make the choice to be in community with family and faith so great that it holds them.
A couple more questions.
Yeah, so I found a lot in your book to be suggestive and inspiring, so thank you. I have one question. There seemed to be kind of a, maybe what you call a tension sort of running through the book, because you're recommending the strategic withdrawal, which I think there's a lot attractive about that. But then there's also an impulse you describe for expansion and evangelism. There's a quote from the monks in Nursia, which is we have to push outward infinitely.
Yeah, Brother Ignatius.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how exactly does that work? the stability that you recommend seems to require staying put and obviously being very local, right? But then there's also this expansion, this pushing outwards. I'm just wondering how those two fit together.
Thanks for that question. Yep. I mean, it's not, we don't all have the same calling. I mean, if some people weren't called to be missionaries, the faith never would have spread. So I believe we have to discern our own calling, but not just in our own hearts and our families and in our church communities. But more broadly, I think that faith is rhythmic. Christ, before he would go out to preach, he would always retire to the desert for prayer. And I think that in order, that this is how we live our lives. Church on Sunday is a time we go for worship and to gather, and depending on your religious tradition, to receive the Eucharist. So you can go out into the world as bearers of Christ. It's not enough in this culture just to go to church on Sunday and keep religion on Sunday or maybe one day in the middle of the week. It has to be our whole lives. That's one of the lessons of the monks. But it is, we have to have that systolic and diastolic, if you will, heartbeat of when we go out into the world and we retreat to be rebuilt, and then go back out and spread what we've learned through contemplation. The Benedictines have a motto, ora et labora, prayer and work, and they believe the two work with each other in that way. So I think there's no formula, but it has to be. You can't be pure action, or the salt will lose its savor. You need contemplation. But if you're purely contemplative and you don't go out into the world and spread the fruits of communing with God, you're hoarding your treasure.
Got time for one more afterwards. Yep.
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for the presentation that you gave. There was a tremendous amount of both, I think, ethical and practical wisdom in it. And I wanted to ask a question which may seem to have a little bit of an evangelical tint, but in the United States of America, and elsewhere, of course, but in America, I think there's a particular history of revival as being a force of tremendous both spiritual and social progress. So the First Great Awakening, you had an opportunity for enslaved African Americans to begin to hear the gospel, whereas slave owners would not allow them to bear witness to the gospel previously. In the Second Great Awakening, you had the momentum of the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement coming on the waves of that. The Azusa mission, of course, and afterwards, following a period of, I think, diminished religiosity in some ways, the 60s saw not just Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but the Billy Graham Crusades and the integration of believers, even in the very deep South. And so there were spiritual fruits reaped in all of these different chapters of American revival, but also social and political progress, which I think not coincidentally sort of attended these spiritual, broad-based spiritual transformations. So my question is there not yet and still, even at this seeming sort of valley in our spiritual consciousness or conscience in America today, is there not yet and still a hope for revival in the Western world, generally speaking, the United States of America in particular? And if there is reason for us to put our hopes in the coming of revival and the spreading of the Holy Spirit once again, is there any tension between that hope and conviction and the Benedict option, the method of strategic withdrawal? Does one tend to pull apart from the other, or is there a sense in which there is or can be a synthesis between the two?
I'm so glad you asked an easy question.
I specialize in
Well,
this.
I have one of the great things about working on this book is how it's brought me into contact with so many evangelicals. I don't know the evangelical tradition. I was raised lukewarm Methodist. We didn't really go to church. I met Christ as a Roman Catholic in my mid-20s, as I said, but I have learned so much from evangelical friends I've worked with on this book. I would say that the church always needs revival. The church always needs reform. But revival itself has to have, when it comes, it has to have some sort of, it has to leave some forms behind or something concrete so we can preserve the gifts of it. You can't always preserve that constant state of ecstasy. It's got to have some kind of concrete forms that remain after the revival is gone. On the other hand, that can easily become, sort of empty ritualism. We got to watch out for that. But I think about the movie To the Wonder. Anybody seen that movie? Terrence Malick film? It's fantastic. It's kind of a difficult movie, but it talks about love, not so much religion, but love. There are two different storylines here. One is a Catholic priest played by Javier Bardem, who is losing, he's going through a dark night of the soul. He can't feel God, but he still maintains his practices. He says Mass, he visits the poor, visits the sick, and just waits for God to come back, to show himself again. He's going through these practices on faith. The other story, it's got Ben Affleck and a French actress who fall in love, but they don't have regular practices and disciplines or commitments to ground their love. So when the passion goes away, they come apart. They can't hold their marriage together. I think this is a parable for us about the need. Yes, we have to have revival. We have to have that passionate experience of God, but we also need some way to keep it alive as best we can, but also to keep ourselves open when the Spirit comes back to us and revives us again. If we don't have the practices to keep ourselves open to it, then we may not be willing to see the Spirit or to receive Him when He comes.
Last question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I understand that the Benedict Option sort of talks about the Christian imperative to withdraw sort of away from the political sphere, and I heard that Christians should only engage in politics insofar, like in charity and in culture building and in conversions. So I guess my question is sort of twofold. To what extent should Christians be involved in sort of mainstream politics? Like, should Christians run for office? And also, like, the second part would be, like, to what extent should Christians disengage from mainstream politics? Like, to what extent, or should Christians vote? Should they participate on the local level? So, to what extent?
Yeah, vote. Absolutely vote and participate as you're called. But understand that none of this is going to matter if you don't have a solid grounding and formation in the faith. And then ultimately, the polity that you need to be most concerned about is the church. And when you put God first and serving Him first, then everything else will follow naturally. If you're called to be involved in national politics or state and local politics, go into it as a Christian and go into it humbly, not thinking that I'm going to save America or take back America. Go into it as a byproduct of the focus of your life, which is serving Christ and being formed in Christ in deep disciplines.
Well, that's a great note to conclude on. I would just add, and also go to Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I'm just saying, if you're called, you should. And I'm calling, by the way. Let's give a big round of applause here for Rod. Also for Dr. Dan Rodriguez as well for great questions and participation. I also want to thank John Barton and the Center for Faith and Learning here. This is not the last time we're going to work together. And again, as I said at the top, as one of the very few graduate policy and politics programs based at a Christian university, these kinds of conversations are the subject matter is so important to who we are. And we are living history right now in our politics and policy. And in that, I think calls like the Benedict Option and arguments made are ones that we really need to wrestle over. And as we've discussed tonight, these are not just things that we wrestle over saying you in Washington or you in Sacramento or you in Los Angeles ought to be doing A, B, and C. But what do I need to be doing? Where am I in my faith? What am I called to do? What am I doing in my own disciplines? Tithing, fasting, praying. What am I doing? Which I think is something that as Christians is a unique call to us all, as well as engaging in politics as we're called to do. So I want to thank you all for being here a half hour over time. This is why we didn't give Convo credit for this, because nobody's going to stick around. But again, I want to thank everyone here. I see faculty from Seaver. I want to thank you all for for coming, and students and others, and my students from the School of Public Policy, thanks for coming out. And again, this is the first of many conversations like this, so please stay tuned. Thanks so much.